Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, however this might find you. It is a pleasure to have you join us here today. We are in the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground, and we are making sure that we observe all good COVID requirements to bring you our program today. You'll see people in various ventures, and we're making sure that we do that the right way. How wonderful that you join us on this day amidst a global pandemic, while we are still struggling about what our democracy might be about, and also while we consider and still are on our journey towards justice, that we could come together in the name of the good Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott to bring you today's program. Without further ado, let's go to Roxbury and around the city for the rest of our program.
Roxbury love to me is home.
Roxbury love is that smile that you get. It's the welcome.
This is geographically the center of the city of Boston. It's the heartbeat.
It really is a place where you can feel comfortable, where you can share ideas, you can be different.
When we think about that great energy of Boston, it's in that one little corner.
Coming into Roxbury is like walking in a bed of sunflowers. It's vibrant, it's colorful. You're going to meet a lot of individuals from all walks of life.
You had the greats of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. You had Marcus Garvey, Harriet Tubman. I believe that same energy flows through us today, and we are reigniting the creative economy. That is our mission at Black Market.
So growing up in the area and being able to see vacant lots transformed into farms and being able to see people get food from these farms was very impactful for me.
The inspiration and the story behind the Breathe Life series, I wanted to pay homage to the areas that I've walked and was brought up in.
In the past, they were 3 or 4 different ballrooms, and Hibernian Hall is the last standing. Everyone has used the space as a special place in their heart where they're able to create and take something away from that.
It's nothing like seeing yourself reflected in a book. And a lot of folk in our community didn't see that growing up. So now when you have children who walk in there and the first thing they see is, oh, look at her, she looks like me, or she looks like such and such. It's a beautiful thing. Everybody learns something when they come to Frugal Bookstore.
When you come into Daryl's Corner Bar and Kitchen, it's a total vibe, you know? It's the energy that you're looking for. It's warmth, it's culture, it's vibrancy. You know, you've got music, you've got flavorful food, it's got spices and soul.
It's not about what you wear, it's about who you are and what you want to show to the world. And so we know that this community deserves to have beauty and a place that they go shop. From the moment they walk in that door to the moment they try on their first piece of clothing, it should feel beautiful.
We want to live, work, play, create, and sell within Nubian Square.
When I think of Roxbury Love, I think about the ways that we can unite ourselves together as a community.
It's about building a life and reigniting Nubian Square. That's my dream for Roxbury.
Lord, dear Lord above, God Almighty, God of love, please look down and see my people through. Lord, dear Lord above, God Almighty, God of love, please look down and see my people through. I believe that God put sun and moon up in the sky. I don't mind the gray skies, 'cause they're just clouds passing by. He'll bring peace and comfort to every troubled mind. Come Sunday, oh, come Sunday, that's the day. Often we'll feel weary, but He knows our every care. Come to Him in secret, He will hear your every prayer. Lilies of the valley, neither toil nor spin, and flowers bloom in springtime. Birds will sing. dawn till sunset, men work hard all day. Come Sunday, oh, come Sunday, that's the day. Up from dawn till sunset, men work hard all day, but come Sunday, oh, come Sunday, that's the good, that's the good day.
Good afternoon, all. My name is Karen Holmes Ward. I'm the Director of Public Affairs and Community Services at WCVB-TV in Boston. But I join you today as a proud graduate of Boston University's School of Communications, chair of BU's Black Alumni Leadership Council, and a member of the University Advisory Board. Welcome to our virtual MLK Day 2021 celebration, sponsored by Boston University, the Howard Thurman Center, the City of Boston, and the New England Conservatory. And thank you to the Conservatory for their presentation of Duke Ellington's Come Sunday. On this Sunday, this afternoon, as we celebrate service to community and commemorate what would have been Dr. King's 92nd birthday, we'll take you on a virtual visit to many places around Boston important in the life of Martin and Coretta. Dr. King's vision, his words, and his dream of a just world resonate today. After a season of sickness, a season of social unrest sparked by the death of African Americans at the hands of law enforcement, peaceful Black Lives Matter protests, a free and fair election that many refuse to acknowledge or accept, and a violent insurrection at the Capitol. Just the title alone of his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, have us all asking ourselves the same question. This afternoon, you'll hear from a wide variety of speakers and thought leaders. The Mayor of Boston, Martin Walsh, the president of Boston University, Robert Brown, to Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, founding director of the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research, and Dr. Eddie Glaude, chair of the African American Studies Department at Princeton University, and of course, interspersed with readings and more music from the conservatory. James Baldwin wrote about the resistance movements, dissent, and humanity of young people. Two of Baldwin's essays, The Dangerous Road Before Martin Luther King and They Can't Turn Back, captured Baldwin's admiration of the conviction, tenacity, and the American idealism of a younger generation. So this afternoon, we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King through their shared ability with Baldwin's to transform what it means to be human. We transform that into word, prose, poetry, and art.
They are in a no man's land between black humiliation and white power. They cannot move backwards, and they cannot move forward either. One of the greatest vices of the white bourgeoisie, on which they have modeled themselves, is its reluctance to think. It is its distrust of the independent minds. Martin Luther King Jr., by the power of his personality and the force of his beliefs, has injected a new dimension into our ferocious struggle. He has succeeded in a way no Negro before him has managed to do, to carry the battle into the individual heart and make its resolution the province of the individual will. He has made it a matter on both sides of the racial fence of self-examination and has incurred, therefore, the grave responsibility of continuing to lead in the path he has encouraged so many people to follow. How he will do this, I do not know, but I do not see how he can possibly avoid a break at last with the habits and attitudes, stratagems and fears of the past. We will need every ounce of moral stamina we can find, for everything is changing, from our notion of politics to our notion of ourselves. And we are certain, as we begin history's strangest metamorphosis, to undergo the torment of being forced to surrender far more than we realized we had expected.
Boston University, the New England Conservatory, the Howard Thurman Center, and all those who have made this important event possible. For those of you that I have not had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Carolyn Crockett, and I'm the Chief of Equity for the City of Boston. As Chief of Equity, I have been charged with embedding economic inclusion, health equity, and racial justice into all the city's work and driving equitable outcomes for all Boston residents. As students of Boston and its history, we all know that this is no small task. It never has been. But as Martin Luther King once said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We can't turn back. And the fierce urgency of now demands that we make our voices heard. Days like today invite us to remember the conviction, tenacity, and the will of prophetic leaders like Martin and Coretta Scott King, Fannie Lou Hamer, and James Baldwin, and the fearless young people who took to the streets, front lines, and service counters to demand justice. For all of those who have carried the torch, generation after generation, we stand today in your honor, and we cannot and we will not turn back. It is my pleasure to introduce our mayor, Mayor Marty Walsh, someone who lives and embodies the call to service, justice, and action. Mayor Walsh knows what it means to stand on principle and push for change. He knows what it means to bring people together, to look ahead, to imagine dreams and possibilities that seem impossible only because we have not yet achieved them. In all of these ways, Mayor Walsh calls on us to look within ourselves and to do the work of anti-racism, acknowledge how systemic inequality hurts people in our communities, and actively build a healthier, more just, and more equitable world. With that, it is my great honor and privilege to turn it over to the mayor to offer his remarks on this historic day.
Thank you, Dr. Crockett. Thank you, President Brown and Boston University, as well as the New England Conservatory, for your stewardship of the King's legacy in Boston. Thank you to all the scholars and musicians elevating us today. And thank you to all the students participating or watching at home. You are coming of age in historic times. You have the opportunity to create a better world, and from what I've seen, you've already started doing that. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day is unlike any other holiday in our calendar. It's a day when we reflect on the lives and the teachings of Dr. King and Coretta Scott King in the civil rights movement they helped to lead. More than that, it's a day when we take stock of how far we've come. And we ask, how can we do better in the coming year? Better in the deepest sense of the word. In Boston, we devote special attention to this day. That's because of the King's relationship to our city, and it's because of our commitment in addressing the wrongs of our past and ending the inequities of our present. This year, we need to turn these reflections into purpose and action more than ever before. We're in the midst of a global pandemic that has exploited, exposed, and deepened the injustices in our society, especially the racial inequities in healthcare, housing, income, and job opportunity. In other words, everything Dr. King talked about. But in the midst of all the suffering and struggle, there is hope, just as he also taught us. In Boston, our COVID response has been driven by equity and shows us new opportunities for changing an unjust system. Since the murder of George Floyd, we have witnessed an uprising for racial justice. In the long struggle for freedom, and another moment that opens up the possibility for deep and lasting change. I want to thank everyone who made their voices heard in the streets and in powerful personal conversations. I came out of those conversations determined to maintain the urgency of this moment and build on Boston's progress by addressing all the ways that systemic racism harms people in our city. We declared racism a public health crisis. We launched a health equity plan to end disparities for good. We shifted millions of dollars into youth trauma and mental health programs. We enacted historic police reforms with Black and brown Bostonians leading the work. We became the first city in the United States to write an anti-discrimination fair housing standard into our zoning code. And we reorganized city government, creating the Equity Cabinet and appointing Dr. Crockett to oversee our social justice work and drive equity in all of our policies. These steps are just the beginning. Last Tuesday, I delivered my annual State of the City address. As you may know, it's likely my last. So I made a special appeal. I called on Bostonians to commit, on a personal level, the work of anti-racism. I know for many of you, it's a commitment at the core, who you are in the work that you do. But my appeal is to everyone, especially those who may believe that this is not their responsibility or their cause. After everything we've seen in the last year and in the last 2 weeks in Washington, we must all understand now that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, as Dr. King said. That's true for our city, and it's true for our nation. Thanks to the organizing and the voting of millions of people all across our country, change is coming. In a few days, we will have a Vice President in Kamala Harris who is Black, who is Asian, who is a child of immigrants, and a graduate of a historically Black university. And we'll have a President in Joe Biden who's committed to racial justice. Already, he has nominated the cabinet that represents the people of the United States, the most diverse cabinet in the history. If confirmed by the Senate, it will be my honor to serve in that cabinet as Labor Secretary and to fight for the rights and equity for all working people. I'm not going to Washington by myself. I'm bringing Boston with me, all of Boston. The Boston Dr. King and Coretta Scott King from BU and the New England Conservatory to the 12th Baptist Church in Roxbury. The city that is instilling a major King Memorial at Boston Common and developing a new King Center for Education and Activism in Roxbury. The Boston that is listening to every voice in our communities, addressing our history with honesty and advancing the cause of racial justice with boldness. The Boston of everyone who has participated in these year's King celebrations for 7 years and everyone joining us today. I want to thank everyone once again. This year, our ways of honoring Dr. King's life are different than normal, but I know that more than ever before, we will put today's reflections into action in profound ways in the days and months and years to come.
Greetings from the New England Conservatory, and specifically from the atrium of the Blumenthal Family Library, where we are honored to display this bronze sculpture of Coretta Scott King by artist Tiffany McLean. The work is entitled Continuation of a Dream and was created to celebrate Coretta Scott King's tireless work on behalf of human rights and her absolute dedication to social justice. We count it a great privilege to call Coretta Scott King an alumna. She graduated from NEC in 1954. She was awarded an honorary degree in 1971 and was recognized with a Distinguished Alumni Award in 2004. And so we are thrilled to join Boston University and the City of Boston in today's celebration of the profound work and contributions of Dr. and Mrs. King. Both as individuals and as a couple, the Kings lived their commitment to the principles of freedom, equity, and justice, and so lived their belief in and their commitment to the very concept of humanity. Almost 60 years ago, Dr. King's words and actions galvanized a generation, inspiring a sense of hope and optimism and a commitment to ensuring that the dream he so powerfully articulated would become a reality. As systemic racism, unconscious bias, and white supremacy continue to generate countless imbalances of equity, the urgency of now is ever more, and Dr. King's words continue to have profound resonance. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to make justice a reality. And in this, we can find tremendous inspiration in the person, work, and legacy of Coretta Scott King. From their first meeting as students on Huntington Avenue near the steps of Jordan Hall, through their years of marriage, Coretta Scott King was a vital partner in Dr. King's life and work. As a wife, a mother, a teacher, and an artist, she used her talents, her creativity, her skills, and every opportunity to advance the cause of justice. Her freedom concerts, which combine music with prose and poetry, inspired, created community, and fueled a movement. And after her husband's murder, in the face of unspeakable personal loss, she picked up the torch. She doubled down on the work to realize the dream of a just world, and she extended herself in generous and remarkable ways, even beyond the continually pressing cause of the human rights of Black Americans, to include those of women, the LGBT community, and those affected by economic inequity. Coretta Scott King's presence was full of grace and warmth and immeasurable strength. Her quiet charisma was an inspiration for decades, and her complete and utter faith in her work touched the hearts and souls of generations. She believed in our shared humanity. She showed us the best of what that could be, and she lived a unique and powerful model of leadership. In her 2004 commencement address at NEC, Coretta Scott King exhorted the graduating class. Musicians have a critical contribution to make towards fulfilling the dream of Martin Luther King Jr., she said. Your labors can help to awaken the hearts, souls, and spirits of the coming generation to greater truth, beauty, peace, and harmony, thereby advancing the coming of the beloved community. With this faith and with this commitment, you will be able to meet the challenges of the future with courage, wisdom, and love for all humanity. In 2021, what more relevant model could we possibly hold for ourselves, for our students, and for our institution? Like Dr. King, Coretta Scott King's purpose, words, music, and actions elevated humanity and inspired and changed the world. May our words, music, and actions, individually and collectively, continue her legacy and so contribute to the fulfillment of the dream.
Nothing
An excerpt from James Baldwin's 1962 essay, Letter from a Region in My Mind. The American Negro has the great advantage of never having believed that collection of myths to which white Americans cling, that their ancestors were all freedom-loving heroes, that they were born in the greatest country in the history of the world, or that Americans are invincible in battle and wise in peace. That Americans have always dealt honorably with Mexicans and Native Americans and all other neighbors and inferiors, that American men are the world's most direct and virile, that American women are pure. Negroes know far more about white Americans than that. It can almost be said, in fact, that they know about white Americans what parents, or anyways, mothers, know about their children, and that they very often regard white Americans that way. And perhaps this attitude, held in spite of what they know and have endured, helps to explain why Negroes on the whole, and until lately, have allowed themselves to feel so little hatred. The tendency has really been, insofar as this was possible, to dismiss white people as the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. One watched the lives they led. One could not be fooled about that. One watched the things they did and the excuses that they gave themselves. And if a white man was really in trouble, deep trouble, it was to the Negro's door that he came. And one felt that if one had had white man's worldly advantages, one would never have become as bewildered and as joyless and as thoughtlessly cruel as he. The Negro came to the white man for a roof or for $5 or for a letter to the judge. The white man came to the Negro for love. But he was not often able to give what he came seeking. The price was too high. He had too much to lose. And the Negro knew this too. When one knows this about a man, it is impossible for one to hate him. But unless he becomes a man, becomes equal, it is also impossible for one to love him. Ultimately, one tends to avoid him, for the universal characteristic of children is to assume that they have a monopoly on trouble and therefore a monopoly on you. Ask any Negro what he knows about white people with whom he works, and then ask the white people with whom he works what they know about him. How can the American Negro past be used? It is entirely possible that this dishonored past will rise up soon to smite all of us. A bill is coming in that I fear America is not prepared to pay. The problem of the 20th century, wrote W.E.B. Du Bois around 60 years ago, is the problem of the color line, a fearful and delicate problem which compromises, when it does not corrupt, all American efforts to build a better world, here, there, or anywhere. It is for this reason that everything white Americans think they believe must now be re-examined. What one would not like to see again is the consolidation of peoples on the basis of their color. But as long as we in the West place on color the value that we do, we make it impossible for the great unwashed to consolidate themselves according to any other principle. Color is not a human or personal reality. It is a political reality. But this is a distinction so extremely hard to make that the West has not been able to make it yet. And at the center of this dreadful storm, this vast confusion, stand the black people of this nation, who must now share the fate of a nation that has never accepted them, to which they were brought in chains. Well, if this is so, one has no choice but to do all in one's power to change that fate. And at no matter what risk, eviction, imprisonment, torture, death, for the sake of one's children, in order to minimize the bill they must pay, one must be careful not to take refuge in any delusion. And the value placed on the color of the skin is always and everywhere and forever a delusion. I know that what I'm asking is impossible, but in our time, as in every time, the impossible is the least that one can demand. And one is, after all, emboldened by the spectacle of human history in general, and the American Negro history in particular, for it testifies to nothing less than the perpetual achievement of the impossible. Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country. and change the history of the world. Thank you.
Ibram X. Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University and the founding director of the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a CBS News correspondent. He's the author of many books, including The Stamps from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which won #1 New York Times bestsellers, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism, and You, co-authored with Jason Reynolds, An Anti-Racist Baby, illustrated by Ashley Lushavecki. Dr. Kendi wrote in The Atlantic, "History is calling the future from the streets of protest. What choice will we make? What world will we create? What will we be? There are only two choices, racist or anti-racist." Now I would like to introduce Dr. Ibram Kendi.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And I want to salute the great folks at my home, Boston University, my other home, the city of Boston, of course, the New England Conservatory, and of course, the great Princeton scholar, Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. I'm always excited to celebrate the life and legacy of the author and activist Coretta Scott King. And of course, I'm always excited to really remember and reflect on the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, who's an esteemed BU alum. And indeed, this is my first MLK Day as a member of the BU in Boston community, and it kind of feels different. It feels powerful. It really feels great to be connected to greatness. So, you know, I'm identified as a scholar, but really I'm a student, you know, especially on this day. You know, every year in celebrating King, I seek to learn more about King. Not the King they show us on televisions and textbooks, not the King that polls well in our time, not the King that they want us to believe existed. You know, I really, each day, each MLK Day, seek to learn about the King who was one of the most scorned men in America when he lived, because he dared to say from a jail cell in 1963 that I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. You see, King was scorned because he dared to say when a people are mired in oppression, they realize deliverance only when they have accumulated the power to enforce change. King was scorned because he dared to say, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. And indeed, King was scorned because he dared to say less than a year before his death that he had gone through a lot of soul-searching and even agonizing moments since his March on Washington speech in 1963. And he dared to say his old optimism was a little superficial and he had replaced it with a solid realism. And he dared to say that he foresaw difficult days ahead, candidly admitting that his dream had turned into a nightmare in 1967. And we today are still living through the nightmare, just as we are living through King's dream. And we can no longer claim that his dream of anti-racist progress is all of us, is all of America, and his nightmare of racist progress, like we saw on display on 1/6 in the US Capitol, is not us, is not America. They are indeed both part of America. We can no longer claim that the march of anti-racist progress and then excommunicate this nation. We can no longer excommunicate the march of racist progress if we ever hope to root out racism, if we ever hope to transform this land of inequity and injustice into a land of equity and justice for all. Over the last 4 years, if not before, we all should have witnessed King's nightmare on our nightly news. But I'm not saying this so we should despair. I'm saying this so we could learn from history, so we can learn from King. By the time of his death, by the time he was talking about the nightmare, King had transcended common political divides like liberal and conservative. At that time, he thought more fundamentally. And through the radio of history, I think he's asking us to think more fundamentally too. With inequality quickly changing for the worse, like the climate, with millions of migrants endlessly searching for safety, like the families of gun violence, with racism and sexism and homophobia and nativism as normal and perpetual, as war and COVID deaths and deportations, with harmful pipelines being built underground and lines of communication being cut above ground, our choices as human beings are much more fundamental, much more eternal, much more universal than we normally imagine. There are lies and there are truth, and we must be truth. There is war and there's peace, and we must be peace. There is hierarchy and there's equality, and we must be equality. There's exploitation and there's love, and we must be love. There is injustice and there's justice, and we must be justice. You know, I'm reminded on this day, as I am every day as a resident of Boston, about those Boston abolitionists like Mariah Stewart and David Walker and William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips. I'm reminded that they boldly called for immediate emancipation in the decades leading up to the Civil War, when slavery and slaveholders were strengthening and expanding. Americans literally thought these abolitionists in Boston had lost their mind. Just like King, Americans thought King had lost his mind when he dared to lead those direct action protests against the likes of Bull Connor, when he dared to come out against the Vietnam War in 1967, when he dared to turn towards a poor people's campaign in 1968, when he dared to call for radical changes in his final day. But history tells a story of abolitionists and civil rights activists who were ahead of their times, who were willing to engage in what King described as the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. We need to think past white supremacists terrorizing this nation. Our despair cannot stifle progress in this long-standing quicksand of gradualism. We need to call for immediate equality, immediate accountability. We need to call for much more than actually seems attainable today, and then spend the rest of our lives engaged in the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. Even in the American nightmare, King never lost hope. Does anybody remember what he said the night before he was assassinated in 1968? Well, he said, "We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter to me now, because I've been to the mountaintop, and like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and he's allowed me to go to the mountaintop, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. It is on us our generation to get to the promised land. It is on us to believe that it exists. We are losing this country to cynicism and misinformation and violence and inequality and injustice. But this nation is not lost. It will never be lost, King tells us. So long as we believe change is possible, it will never die. So long as we keep alive the beautiful struggle. Thank you.
One, two, 1, 2, 3.
If I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a word or a song, if I can show somebody that they're traveling wrong, then my living shall not be in vain. Not be in vain. You just call out my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running to see you again. Winter, spring, summer, or fall, all you got to do is call, and I'll be there. Yes, I will. You've got a friend. You just call on me, brother, when you need a hand. We all need somebody to lean on. Don't you know I just might have a problem that you'd understand? We all need somebody to lean on. You just call on me, brother, when you need a hand. We all need somebody to lean on. Don't you know I just might have a problem that you'd understand? We all need somebody to lean on. Call me, call me, call me, call me. All you gotta do is call me, call me, call me, call me. All you gotta do is call me, call me, call me, call me. All you gotta do is call me, call me, call me, call me. All you gotta do is call me, call me, call me, call me. We all need somebody to lean on.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jean Morrison, University Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Boston University. On behalf of the entire BU community, I want to thank the City of Boston, the Howard Thurman Center, the New England Conservatory, the Inner Strength Gospel Choir, and of course, Dean Elmore and his terrific team in the Dean of Students Office for working together today to make this event possible. We have an exceptional program today. Its quality speaks to the commitment of so many to honor Dr. and Mrs. King's memory and the ideals for which they stood so fearlessly throughout their lives. It's hard to imagine a time in modern history when those ideals and the moral leadership, strength, and example that accompanied them have seemed more relevant or been in greater demand for our nation. Over the past year, our country, against the backdrop of a raging global pandemic, has engaged in a long overdue national conversation about the enduring grip of racism on our society, our policies, and our systems. If there is any doubt about the urgency of this conversation and the needed work to make change, one need only to look, and more importantly, to see and to feel the current very public display of violent white supremacy in our country. We must understand our history and then work to change our policies and systems, as Professor Kendi is leading us to do. It's my great pleasure today to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Eddie Glaude, Jr., who has devoted a great deal of thought to these issues in his teaching and writing, most recently in his new book that explores the enduring literary legacy of James Baldwin. Dr. Glaude is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor and Chair of African American Studies at Princeton University, and he is among our nation's most respected scholars on the complexities of race and American democracy. He's the author of numerous acclaimed books exploring faith, Black communities, and the American experience, including Democracy in Black: How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, In a Shade of Blue: Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America, and Exodus: Religion, Race, and Nation in Early 19th Century Black America, which was awarded the Modern Language Association's William Sanders Scarborough Book Prize. In his latest book, Begin Again: James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Today, Dr. Glaude examines Baldwin's lasting impact on the way we as Americans view issues of race, culture, and reconciliation, writing that is particularly poignant in the wake of the tragic and tumultuous events of the past year, and indeed the last few weeks. Dr. Glaude is the former president of the American Academy of Religion. He is a columnist for Time magazine and an MSNBC contributor. He also regularly appears on NBC's Meet the Press. Dr. Glaude holds a master's degree in African American Studies from Temple University and a PhD in religion from Princeton University. As we gather this afternoon to honor the legacy of two of our finest citizens and to recognize both the hope and the challenges they saw for humanity, voices like Dr. Glaude's are essential. To fully honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy, it will take courage, introspection, and the opening of our hearts and hard work to root out and repair injustice in our society. That is the journey Dr. King spoke of over half a century ago during his time in Boston. It's a journey that continues today, and about which there are few people better equipped to speak than Professor Glaude. And with that, it's my real pleasure to hand things over to Professor Eddie Glaude, Jr.
Thank you so much, Provost Morrison. I really appreciate that gracious introduction. I'm kind of unsettled. I don't know what to say after the brilliance of Professor Kendi, but I'll try to offer a word. I want to thank the New England Conservatory and the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground and the broader BU community for making this wonderful day possible. I'm humbled to be here. I want to thank President Brown and Mayor Walsh and for their leadership and Dean Elmore and all the folks behind the scenes who have made this day possible. My time is short, so I want to jump right into this, if that's okay with you. I want to begin with a quotation from the great Ralph Waldo Emerson from an essay published in 1840 entitled Circles. Our culture is the predominance of an idea, Emerson writes, which draws after it this train of cities and institutions. Let us rise into a new idea, and they will disappear, end quote. Just 11 days or so ago, a mob of mostly white men and women sacked the U.S. Capitol. They roamed the halls of the People's House and declared that they were there to stop the steal, to act as patriots on behalf of a country in peril. Americans watched as the Capitol Police were overrun and as some among them seemingly agreed with what was by any measure an insurrection. I think 15 or so of the Capitol Police are currently under investigation by the FBI. At the time, I couldn't help but think of the police response to the protests after the murder of George Floyd. Of course, there was violence then. Minneapolis exploded, but I recall the peaceful marches and how they confronted a militarized police force, rubber bullets and tear gas, images of police aggressively accosting protesters. But on January 6th, I saw some police taking selfies and even one officer helping a woman in a camel-haired coat wearing a red and white and blue palm beanie with the word Trump emblazoned on the front. He helped her walk down the stairs, the steps of the Capitol. She was part of the group who stormed the building and now was among those who simply walked out. In many ways, the insurrection we witnessed on January 6th was the logical extension of the conservative response to the Black freedom movement of the mid-20th century. For well over 40 years, we have been living in that reaction. As some railed against big government and so-called entitlement programs, and others built the carceral state that has resulted in the incarceration of millions of Americans, mostly Black and brown, we have witnessed the evisceration of any idea of public life in place of a kind of ruthless form of competition, which increasingly defines our way of living together. We've left behind a robust conception of citizenship for the idea that we are all self-interested persons in pursuit of our own aims and ends in competition and rivalry with others. So much so that for some, liberty has become a synonym for selfishness. We see those among us who refuse to wear a mask to protect their fellows. Ain't that something? In this context, communal life has given way to gated communities and communities of hyper-concentrated poverty. We've seen, in effect, the flatlining of wages among workers, the skyrocketing of student loan debt, increased precarity for working people as the rich has continued to extract resources for themselves and the rest have struggled to keep their noses barely above water. This was the reaction to the demand for a more racially just America, the dismantling of the Great Society and a wholesale attack on the very framework of the New Deal. Our politics today have been overdetermined by the terrors and panic of the so-called forgotten American, a panic rooted in the unsettling sense that the whiteness of this country was and is under siege. What we saw on the steps of the Capitol were those Americans, those so-called forgotten Americans in full revolt in the face of the prospect that their world is dying. Over the course of our history, there has been a kind of consensus that goes beyond, or better, sits behind the specific claims of American consensus historiography in the 1950s that presumed the unity of American values and muted the conflicts that animated our way of life. That consensus was, and for some still is, that ours is a white republic and must remain so. This view shapes how we talk about difference in this country, how we characterize, say, the demands of the 1960s, and how some think about the so-called problem of multiculturalism, and why so many Americans are horrified by the demographic shifts taking place in the country right now. At the heart of it all is a kind of consensus around whiteness that cuts across party lines and regions. It is an inheritance of sorts, the offspring of the whiteness that allowed the Compromise of 1877, which undermined radical Reconstruction and birthed the country that was a model for Hitler's Germany. There are those among us who have and who are still willing to toss this democracy into the trash bin in defense of this view. And the nation's historical refusal to acknowledge this fact has meant that we have been and will be repeatedly brought to the brink of collapse because of it. On April 3rd, 1968, it's a speech that Dr. Abram Kendi just referenced. On the eve of his assassination, Dr. King spoke of what he had glimpsed on the horizon. On this stormy night, when he did not want to get out of his motel bed, where a feeling in his gut told him that death was near, he made his way to the pulpit in Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. And he found the words to inspire and to warn. He spoke of the power of the historical moment and what it meant for those ordinary people to be called to risk everything on this day in 1968. And he reminded the crowd of the ongoing failure of the country to make real its promise. Remember, he was organizing with garbage workers. He understood the glaring contradiction of being poor in the richest country in the history of the world. Quote, "It's all right to talk about long white robes over yonder and all of its symbolism," he said. "But ultimately, people want some suits and dresses and shoes to wear down here. It's all right to talk about streets flowing with milk and honey, but God has commanded us to be concerned with the slums down here and his children who can't eat 3 square meals a day. It's all right to talk about the new Jerusalem, but one day God's preacher must talk about the new New York, the new Atlanta, the new Philadelphia, the new Los Angeles, the new Memphis, Tennessee. This is what we have to do," end quote. Here, Dr. King turned the attention of the audience to the material conditions that characterized their way of life. Too many languished in poverty. Too many struggled to imagine a fruitful tomorrow. And then the famed preacher, the man we celebrate today, offered the words that mean so much to many of us, that Professor Kendi quoted, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. Now, Professor Kendi emphasized the hope that's latent in this formulation. But all too often, and it's important to remember this, but all too often on this day, we rush to celebrate the life of Dr. King. We're quick to talk about the promised land, but we forget about what he said. We've got some difficult days ahead. Since his death in 1968, America has turned its back on what Dr. King died for. And just a few days ago, just 11 or so days ago, we all saw thousands willing to sack the Capitol in the name of a world, in the name of that consensus around whiteness that Dr. King sought so ably to destroy. National anniversaries of death can be a tricky lot, to be used by whomever lays claim to the dead body buried in the ground that cannot speak back. Time can make matters worse. The farther we get away from the actual life lived, the more enchanted we are by the fables and myths that secure our illusions and deepen our fantasies. Dr. King has been dead almost 60 years now, and over this half century or so, his bones have been picked clean. Conservatives invoke his name in defense of their vision of a colorblind society to justify the status quo. Liberals use him to authenticate their own milquetoast politics while they tinker around the edges. And black politicians yoke his legacy all too often to their selfish ambitions. They pimp him in the name of their own careers and their own desires to walk the corridors of power. In so many ways, Dr. King's life has been reduced to a 4-word sentence: I have a dream. And his politics to a basic affirmation of American ideals. He's the lead character in a story the nation tells itself about the movement, which begins with the landmark Supreme Court decision of 1954, the heroic refusal of Rosa Parks, the challenge of student sit-ins, and culminates with the 1963 March on Washington or the 1965 Selma March. It is a neat story with Southern villains and heightened drama and tragic deaths and heroic triumph. But in that story, there's no mention of Dr. King's depression, no reckoning with what he said to his friend, Reverend D.E. King, quote, "I found out that all that I've been doing in trying to connect this system in America, to correct this system in America, has been in vain. The whole thing will have to be done away with," end quote. Instead, ours is a story that secures the inherent goodness of this country and enlists Dr. King's life in fortifying the illusion that allows us to pat ourselves on the back and say a job well done. In his last book, Where Do We Go From Here?, Dr. King argued, among other things, that white supremacy stood in the way of democracy in this country, that it was an ever-present force in America, frustrating the dreams of the nation's darkest citizens and undermining any pretense to racial justice. He wrote, quote, "Negroes have proceeded from a premise that equality means what it says, and they have taken white Americans at their word when they talk of it as an objective. But most whites in America proceed from a premise that equality is a loose expression for improvement." King says, white America is not even psychologically organized to close the gap. Essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful and less obvious, but in most respect, to retain it. End quote. Now, I spent a lot of time thinking about this passage. I don't have a lot of time to meditate on it with you today, but King's formulation hinges on a devastating judgment about our so-called national commitment to racial justice. He claimed that the country viewed racial equality as a loose expression for improvement. When thought in this way, racial justice gets reduced to a charitable enterprise, a philanthropic practice by which white people do good for black people. And as long as we're caught in that frame, we'll never get to a really anti-racist position, Professor King, because some people believe that equality is theirs to give to others. And as long as we're in that frame, we're caught. Now, King did not draw this conclusion from some abstract set of ideological principles. This was a lesson learned from experience. The brutality of the South and the moral hypocrisy of the country generally led him to conclude that the belief that white people were superior to others and that equality was something to be given distorted the principles of democracy and disfigured the moral character of those who believed the lie. For him, this was the underlying problem that haunted America, that white racism deformed and distorted the characters of those who embraced it, blocking the way for the development of the kinds of people that democracy required. Now, in this moment, we can no longer tell ourselves a story, I'm coming home, a story of American virtue that secures our innocence. James Baldwin insisted as much. As he put it in The Fire Next Time, it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence that constitutes the crime, end quote. Baldwin relentlessly exposed the lies that America tells itself. He, like Dr. King, wanted us to engage in the kind of self-examination required for a fuller understanding of ourselves. In an essay published in 1964 entitled Nothing Personal, he put the point succinctly, quote, "We are afraid to reveal ourselves because we trust ourselves so little. And in this labyrinth, the person is desperately trying not to find out what he really thinks. Therefore, the truth cannot be told, even about one's attitudes. We live by lies," Baldwin said. He understood that our problems in the United States went beyond politics or the latest example of American racism. For Baldwin, quote, "The lie has penetrated our most private moments and the most secret chambers of our hearts." Recent events are just the latest indication of a deep-seated American malaise. Americans are trapped in a history they refuse to know but carry within themselves. The terrors and panic they experience have everything to do with the gap between who they imagine themselves to be and who deep down they really are. That the nation actively evades confronting this gap locks the country into a kind of perpetual adolescence where those who desperately hold on to the American myth as some kind of New Eden refuse to grow up. And for Baldwin, condemnation to eternal youth is, quote, a synonym for corruption. Can you imagine living in never, never land forever? My Lord. At the time of his death, Dr. King understood that if we're going to achieve our country, we would have to shatter the fables and myths that protect our national innocence, shatter this consensus around white identity that protect this conception of the republic. We would have to confront the lies that give comfort to the status quo. We would have to look in the mirror and finally see who or what is looking back at us. The last 4 years, hell, the last few days, have ripped off the mask of this nation's racial politics. All of the racial dog whistles and coded speech that have been a part of America's politics over the last 40 years or so have been tossed away for an explicit appeal to white America. The genie is out of the bottle. Our task is not to push it back in, but to imagine the country without it. Are we willing to imagine America as a truly multiracial democracy? Or are we willing to toss this fragile experiment in democracy into the trash bin? Herman Melville returns, at least he comes to mind to me. Quote, but not yet have we solved the incantation of this whiteness and learned why it appeals with such power to the soul, Melville wrote. Oh, we have some difficult days ahead. The celebration of Dr. King in this moment of storm and stress occasions an extraordinary opportunity for us. We can confront the life in the grave, not for who we want him to be, but for who he actually was, faults and all. And with him, imagine a new life for the nation. Here, a new kind of consensus can emerge as the background conditions for a different way of being together are created and the beloved community can take shape. In our intimate relationships with each other, we can break down the barriers that blind us to the humanity of those with whom we live. We can cast away the false idols of racism and treasure the beauty of human beings and all of their difference. We can usher in a new moral and social contract with each other where Americans are guaranteed health care as a right, guaranteed a basic quality of life with a roof over their heads and a living wage, and where we can live safely and securely with each other. How Dr. King imagined civic life, how he imagined leadership, how he insisted on the value of the beloved community shorn of sentimentality and rooted in a just order, his unshakable willingness to speak truth to power, no matter the consequences. These values ought to shape our embrace of him, not the image of the happy, nonviolent saint who sanctifies our national innocence. What will we do in the face of these two dying worlds, these two worlds standing side by side, one world dying, one desperately trying to be born? What will we do in this moment when a new America is trying to be born and the umbilical cord of white supremacy is wrapped around the baby's neck? Will you be better midwives, or will you traffic in myths and fables in order to secure your innocence and sanctify your conscience? What kind of America do you want to live in? If you want to answer that question, then you're going to have to re-examine this feast. You're going to have to re-examine what it means to celebrate Dr. King in this moment. And if you're not willing to step up in the way that he said, then I reject your ritual. I'm reminded of the words of the prophet Amos, and I'm coming home. I hate and I despise your feasts, and I will take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Yea, though ye offer me burnt offerings and your meal offerings, I will not accept them, Amos says. But let justice well up as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. Let us all join together and imagine a different way of being together. Let us all become better midwives, Let us ask ourselves the question, will Dr. King be disappointed in us? And our answer should be no, because we're working. We're tending in the fields to build a new Jerusalem. Yes, we are. Yes, we are. But we understand we got some difficult days ahead. Thank you so very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Robert Brown, president of Boston University. Let me begin by thanking all the talented speakers, singers, and musicians for bringing their talents and insights today so that we can carry on our tradition of celebrating the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, even with COVID-19 in our midst. I want to take this opportunity to thank Mayor Martin Walsh for his devoted service to the city and his partnership with Boston University to make this a very special citywide event. I also want to take this opportunity to congratulate him on his nomination to serve as Secretary of Labor for the United States. I have watched with admiration as Mayor Walsh has guided the city for 7 years. His affection for the people of Boston and his unbreakable bond to his hometown have been ever visible in his actions. We lose a great mayor. The nation gains a great leader. I also want to thank Catherine Kennedy, Director of the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground, and our Dean of Students and Associate Provost Ken Elmore for their leadership in making this program possible today. This is far from the traditional program for these celebrations. We're holding this event in what will be known forever as the winter of COVID-19 in the United States. Because of the virus, we are participating either remotely or socially distanced in the Thurman Center. For 10 months, we have spent our lives on Zoom instead of with people, together only in cyberspace, physically separate. We have proved that we can change and adapt, stay well, and keep each other safe. What we are doing is anything but normal the way it was in the past. The state we all yearn to have again. My thought for you today as we leave this event is that we should not accept the old normal. We will defeat COVID-19. With the vaccinations, we will return to the previous rhythms of life, meeting at will with family and friends, going out to dinner, going to the movies, hugging each other. Let's not look for the old normal. The year of COVID-19 has also made clear that we have accepted for too long systemic racism in our society. Let us commit ourselves to change, to defining a new normal in which we do not accept anything less than equality for all people. A world where policing is equally applied to everyone, where one race does not have a much higher probability of coming down with the virus and suffering most acutely from the illness, a world with equality for everyone. As we think about our lives after COVID, let's look inside ourselves to find the ways we each must change to create this normal. Universities are like people, with their profiles defined by their actions and choices throughout history. However, they differ from people in one very important characteristic. Individuals age, and as we do so, may become, as we've seen many times, set in our ways. Universities must be ageless. Universities must continue to evolve, adapt, and we hope move towards a greater relevance in serving the greater good of our society. Boston University is on a journey through time. We are continually changing and evolving, as does the world around us, while staying true to our mission. As we change, we're striving to be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, with the hope that someday we may be counted among the leaders in creating the new normal. I hope all here today will help us on this journey. With God's help, we will succeed. Thank you.
Today, we gathered in the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, and are reminded of James Baldwin's powerful witness and words. Through musicians and speakers, our community partners reflected on the depth, power, and ever-increasing relevance and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words beyond those of his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Thank you to the production crews of the City of Boston, the New England Conservatory, and Boston University. Thank you to all of today's participants who illuminated the King's profound thinking and action related to the issues of community, social justice, peace, and love. As the director of the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground at Boston University, I must leave you with words from Dr. Howard Thurman to reflect upon, and I quote, "Keep alive the dream, for as long as you have a dream in your heart, you cannot lose the significance of living," close quote. Now, let us all hold on to dreams of a more perfect union, health, and justice for all. Thank you.